Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Nebraska Farm Bureau's Inside Profitability. My name is Austin Harthorn. I'm the onboarding economist here at Nebraska Farm Bureau. You're probably used to seeing Jay Rempe. Jay hosts a lot of these webinars, but as some of you know, Jay is on the path to retirement. So this Inside Profitability series, it's a series of webinars and podcasts kind of focused on specifically producer profitability. We hope the series will be informative and bring value to you guys. If you guys have any topics, anything that you'd like to see discussed in the future, please reach it out to us. The chief interest here is discussing what you guys see as valuable and what you guys care about. So if you have any of those, I'll drop my email at the end, but my email is austinh@nefb.org. In terms of today, though, our topic is insurance, specifically pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, PRF for short. We've talked a lot about drought in our recent webinars, and relatedly here today, we'll discuss one of the methods you can use to protect your farm and ranch against the impacts of these dry conditions. Drought, of course, has been up there with rising input costs and several other things as one of the main things that are concerned among our members, and for good reason. 100% of the state is under some form of drought, and the most recent crop progress report indicates about 82% of pasture ground is in poor or very poor condition. Which actually led to some herd liquidation across the state, as there's just that much less grazing capacity and hay production. Anyways, one of the programs that you can use to protect yourself against these poor range conditions and overall loss of forage is the PRF coverage, pasture, rangeland, and forage. This program works to pay an indemnity if the rainfall falls below a coverage level based on historical rainfall levels. Some of you are probably familiar with PRF or maybe even used in the past, but we'll really dive into the nitty-gritty here and discuss all the details, how it works, and also some guidelines you can use in selecting coverage. And to help us do that, we've got the PRF expert himself, Aaron Berger from Nebraska Extension, to share some insights on the program. Aaron is a beef extension educator based in Kimball, and he represents the southern Panhandle region of Nebraska. He has several publications out related to PRF program specifically, but he covers anything and everything related to cow-calf and overall ranch production, ranch management, anywhere from genetic selection to pasture management. Aaron, thanks for joining us today. Really looking forward to what you've got to say here. So.
All right, thanks for the opportunity. So I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen and just kind of walk through a presentation here. If you'll notice, I'm sitting in a kitchen and I've got my Carhartts on. So I share some responsibilities between Nebraska Extension and also a ranch situation. And so today I'm at my ranch job and doing this over my dinner break. And so just if you're wondering, why is my dress like that? And why is that a kitchen in the background? That's the reason why. So let me go ahead and share my screen and then we'll just walk through pasture, range, and forage insurance and talk about it a little bit. All right. So I think as we start, I just want to walk through what pasture, rangeland, forage insurance is. Many of you may already be very familiar with it, how it works, and we'll just kind of walk through some fundamentals I think you need to know and understand before you think about purchasing the insurance, and also just talk a little bit about some philosophical approaches to how you might think about using this based on your personality type, based on how you view risk, and what may be some things that would be best fit for you in terms of thinking about how to use this. So we're going to cover what is this, how does it work, how has it performed where your land is? So if it's land you own or land you rent, how has that worked? Should you use it? I think this is a question that you have to ask for yourself. This isn't for everyone. It's not a good fit for everyone. And so really that's one of the questions to ask is as you begin to understand the program and the product, do you think it's something that fits you? And then if you decide you do want to use it, how should you use it? And I'll talk about that a little more. And then I think also as you go to work with a crop insurance agent, because that's who you work with in purchasing this, what are some things in my mind that I think you should know when you go to be an informed consumer? The other thing, just from a disclaimer standpoint, I don't have no skin in the game in terms of whether you buy this insurance or not. So I don't have a brother who sells it or something like that. It makes no difference to me whether you use the insurance or not. So I really want to try to give you, from my perspective, just some objectivity around the product and considering using it. So as we think about pasture, rangeland, forage insurance, it's really insuring for precipitation. It's not insuring for forage production. I think that's important to understand. you can have situations where you may have a really pretty good year from a precip standpoint, but still have less than average forage production or something like that. And so you're not insuring for forage production, you're insuring for precip. Obviously, we know that precipitation and forage production are correlated, but they're not a one-to-one. And so just understanding that's important. Also, in terms of the data that's used for precipitation, it comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and also the Climate Prediction Center. So they're using rainfall that actually falls on the recording sites and then interpolating that to the grid that you have insured. And so this is the other thing that's important to understand. It may not be one-to-one. What I mean by that is you may not get rain on your ranch, but the grid as a whole, they say, did get precip. And so sometimes there can be disappointment with that. On the other hand, I've seen this happen as well. You may be in a situation where thunderstorms happen to hit your ranch, but don't hit your neighbor. And for the grid, you actually get more grass production than would be expected, and you still get an indemnity. Now, over the long term, this works out, but from year to year, there can be disappointment on this one. And so you just need to understand that. Again, it's rainfall insurance. So they're looking at the long-term averages for 2-month intervals. And then if there's a deficit below that, based on what you have insured, then you become eligible to collect on the insurance. You're going back to 1948 in terms of rainfall data. So, we're looking at a long period of time in terms of historic rainfall. Coverage for the insurance is January 1 through December 31st. And so, as I said, you're insuring by grid, not by an individual farm or ranch. The grids are 1/4 degree latitude by 1/4 degree longitude, or for about Nebraska, approximately 13 miles east to west in terms of width. And then if you go north to south, about 17 miles in terms of length. Precipitation data is collected daily from the 4 closest weather stations to the center of the grid. And then that data is interpolated for the grid. And that's, as I've already said, is something you need to understand. It's not actually rainfall on your operation. So this is different than hail insurance or something like that, where obviously you get hailed, you get an indemnity. This is for a grid. And so that's a little bit harder sometimes for people to understand in terms of understanding the insurance. Here's a tool that I really think if you're considering using the grids, you need to go use. And so you could take a screenshot of this or go write it down, but you need to go use the Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage support tool. If you type that Pasture, Rangeland, Forage support tool into a search engine, this website will pop right up. And so I'm going to kind of walk through an example from that website in terms of how you want to go ahead and look at this and think about using it. So when you go there, here's the tool that will pop up. Again, you're going to want to go ahead and put in your address, and you can zoom to the grid you're in. I grew up near a place just east of North Platte, and so I put in a location just east of there to near Maxwell to look at a grid there. So here's again the map blowing up. I picked this grid just northeast of North Platte, and you can see this grid here. So you can actually get a grid number, and then based on if your ranch all falls in this grid, then that's where you need to buy insurance for. Now, there's sometimes where you might have a ranch that straddles 2 different grids, and I'll talk about that. That actually, in my mind, can be an advantage. And then, if you happen to be right where these 4 grids intersect, you may have land in several grids. So understanding what land you have, what grid it's in is important. You can insure all grids. If you have land that touches, and you can insure for one particular grid. As you think about doing that, just work with your crop insurance agent on that. So here's some things you need to think about or understand. First, what are the things you want to use that land for? Is it going to be for grazing? Is it going to be for haying? What's the intent of that? So you can insure for both. You want to pick your level of coverage. So here we're thinking about the amount of precip. You can insure for 90% of precipitation, 80 to 85, 70 and 75. You also have a productivity factor. So we'll look at that a little bit more, but it's basically saying, based on the county's valuation of forage for my location, do I want to increase the value of productivity or decrease it? Insurable interest. If you're in a partnership or something like that, you can only insure for the interest you have. Also, if you're renting land, you have to rent this on a per acre basis if you're going to take the insurance. If you're renting pasture on a so much per pair per month or so much per head per day, then the landowner is the one who is the person who has the insurance. Of course, you've got to want to think about what acres do you want to insure. You don't have to insure all your acres. You can insure a portion of those. And then also what 2-month intervals do you want to select for the insurance? So as I said, this is the different coverage levels you can have. 70% coverage would insure 70% of precip for the 2-month interval. So the challenge with this is that, it may be dry all of March and April, and then towards the end of April, you get some big moisture events. If that moisture event happens the day before the end of the month, it still counts into that 2-month interval. And so if it's, let's say it comes out to be 71% of the long term for that 2-month interval, and you insured for 70, you don't get anything. And so that's just, I think some things to think through and understand. The other thing that you need to understand is the reason this insurance typically pays more than the cost of the premium is because it's significantly subsidized. So with the 70 and 75% coverage level, it's subsidized 59%. At 80 and 85, it's 55, and at 90%, it's 51%. So you can think about this from an actuarial perspective. With it being subsidized at this level, candidly, if you participate over a 15, 20-year period, and you participate every year, and depending on the months you insure for, usually when I look at it over the long term, you're going to get something like $1.50 to $1.70 back for every dollar you put in. Now, that doesn't happen every year, but if you look at this over the long period, that's usually what happens. We talked about this productivity factor. Depending on where you're at, you need to look at, do I think I want to raise the productivity factor or maybe reduce it? I would say almost in every situation I look at Nebraska, if you want to get the value of the forage production close to its market value, you probably need to look at upping this productivity factor. In many cases, the value of forage, that's the county base value, typically is less than the market value of forage. And so I usually encourage people to look at increasing this productivity factor if you're trying to insure for the value of the forage. I already mentioned insurable interest. You have to be able to validate the acres you have insured. If you're working with your FSA office on any kind of program, you're already validating acres, and so it's not hard to do that. Also, again, if you're renting acres and you have that on a cash basis, then you also need to make sure you have a lease arrangement that you can verify that you are paying cash for this ground. It's not on a per acre or per head basis. It's not a per head basis. It's on a per acre basis, and that way you can buy the insurance on the ground if it's grazing land or hay land. These are the 11th 2-month intervals. If you're insuring in a specific grid, you can't double up. So I can't insure January, February, March. If those 2-month intervals overlap, then you can't insure those two together. You can select, you have to select at least 2 intervals and up to 6, and the intervals can't overlap, as I've said, and you can't have more than 60% coverage in any 2-month interval. So let's say I say May, June are my big months, and I want to just really load that up in terms of coverage. Well, I can't put more than 60% of my coverage on that 2-month interval. And also, if you want to insure an interval, you can't put in less than 10. So other than that, you've got quite a bit of flexibility. So I already mentioned these county base values and understanding the base value of the forage. These are on assigned basis through your local FSA office, and it's so much per dry land acre, so much per hay land, so much per irrigated. Again, you're insuring only on perennial forage production. If you're looking to insure annual forages like a triticale or oats or something like that, there is an annual forage insurance. It's a different product. You can purchase that, but this is only for perennial forage. So alfalfa, perennial grasses, those would all qualify from a hay perspective. Again, let's go back to our grid and just play with that a little bit. Again, this is northeast of North Platte. And so I went in and I pulled up this tool And I just put in, let's say for, looking at 90% coverage. So I'm ensuring at the highest level of precipitation and also ensuring for the highest level of productivity. How would that have looked in terms of cost? So here's that county base value. I'm going to blow that up. So for Lincoln County, for this particular grid, it has a county base value of $23.40. So what they're saying is the forage production off of that acre of ground there is worth about 23 bucks. Well, I happen to know for that area, if you're renting grass, the value of grass is significantly more than that if you're looking at its market value. So that's why I bumped that productivity factor to 150. In this case, I just said a 5,000 acre ranch. Now we're going to insure again at that maximum amount. So we have basically total policy protection of almost $158,000, which basically what this says is if it didn't rain at all in the grid for a whole year, you would get almost $160,000 in an indemnity. Obviously, that's never going to happen, or at least I hope it never happens, but that's the amount of protection you're looking at. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. So really the thing to remember here is you increase productivity and you increase the amount of dollars of protection. Also, the cost of your premium goes up. And so that's not hard to understand. It's just like insurance on a car or vehicle. The more expensive your vehicle is, the more coverage you have. And also the lower, you think about your cost, the more expense you have, the more you're going to have in cost of insurance. So as you think about insurance, you think about using this. If you're thinking about insuring for forage production, you need to ask the question, when does precip impact forage production for me? So where I'm at here, or where we're looking at in this grid, for this particular grid, this is sandhills. So April, May, and June, July are big drivers of forage production here. It's a mix of cool season and warm season. And so that's why I will look at the intervals I chose, but that's why I looked at that. Then you need to think about, well, if I chose these intervals, how would they have performed historically? So go back and say, if I bought this insurance over the last 20 years, how would this have worked? And then also look at years when it was really dry. So we've had years like 2002, 2012, 2022, where you want to say, if I'm thinking about forage production and I insured this, how would I have got paid? You also want to think about what would have been the return to premium over time, and then how frequently would you have got an indemnity? And this is where I think you need to start thinking about, if I buy the insurance and I don't get paid, how is that going to affect me psychologically? So what I mean by that is a majority of forage production is driven by precipitation in the Nebraska, April, May, June, July. Those are the big months. So let's say you loaded up those months because that's the major ones on forage production, but then you don't get an indemnity. And let's say you do that for 3 or 4 years. Here's what I often see happen. People are like, why am I buying this insurance? I'm not getting paid anything. I'm just spending money and getting nothing back. However, if you spread some coverage over the whole year, the likelihood of you getting an indemnity goes up, which helps cover part of your premium cost. And then you're probably more likely to play. So that's where the whole situation of you need to think about, how do I want to use the insurance? So the times of the grid, like November, December, January, February, where you typically are drier months, those have higher premium costs. If you think about that, that makes sense, right? So they have less precip fall in that 2-month interval. It also tends to be higher in variability. Well, if you have greater risk of there being low precip, then from an insurance standpoint, you're going to have a higher cost or higher premium on those months. And so that's just something to understand as you're thinking about buying the insurance. All right, I've already talked about this in terms of thinking about your forage resource, thinking about when precipitation impacts forage production. I think that really drives how you may want to think about using the insurance. So for that particular grid, I just said, let's look at the last 30 years and say I maximize the insurance. Now, I'm not recommending you do this. I'm just using this as an example. So I said, let's insure for 90% of precipitation, and we're going to insure for 150% of county base value of forage. So the premium on 5,000 acres after the subsidy would be about $13,267, which sounds like a lot. and it is, or about $2.65 per acre. So if you looked at that, and for this particular example, I put 10% coverage in January, February, 20% in March, April, 30% in May, June, 20% in July, August, 10% September, October, 10% November, December. So I have insurance in the 6 2-month intervals for the whole year. Now, if you look at the last 30 years, over the last 30 years, at 90% coverage, there would have been an indemnity paid 17 out of 30 years, or a little more than half the time. Also, an indemnity would have covered the premium expense 17 out of 30 years, which means that your cost of the insurance would have been totally covered 17 out of the 30 years. Now, and plus there would have been some on top of that. The other thing is that if you spent $1 on the insurance over the last 30 years, you would have got $1.54 back. For every dollar you put in terms of premium expense, you would have got $1.54 back in terms of indemnity. So that was a paying proposition. So over the last, again, 1992 through 2021, average annual premium of a little over $13,000, average annual indemnity of a little over $20,000, or a net of $7,000, a little over $7,000. So the challenge is there's some wet years, especially in the 90s, where you would have gone a number of years and not gotten any indemnity. So you're paying the insurance, but not getting any premium back. However, the last 3 years, you would have gotten some back. In a year like this, you would have got a significant amount of money back that you could have then used to help cover some of the increased cost that you're incurring because of the loss of forage production. So some important things to remember. Sales closing date on this is December 1st, and that's just a month away. If you're thinking about using this, you really need to, and you're not used it before, you really need to start being aggressive about being informed on understanding the insurance, finding insurance agents you want to work with, and get that set up, because you need to have your stuff in place by December 1st. Premium for the insurance typically is billed September 1st. Sometimes that's delayed, but depending on some government programs and how they want to address this. The thing about that is because it's billed September 1st, let's say you have coverage throughout the year. If you're getting an indemnity for coverage in January, February, and March, April, that indemnity goes towards the cost of your premium. And so there's a lot of times when you may have your premium covered by indemnities already early in the year before you get to September 1st. All right, so kind of some thoughts on application and use. I really encourage you, if you're considering using this, go use the tool. Think about what you would want to do or what you might consider doing with the insurance, and then do some analysis. And if you're familiar with Excel, you can export the results out of that tool into Excel. I really like doing that because then you can begin to manipulate it. Think about, okay, what's the cost of the premium? If I get indemnity, how many years would I got paid? And you can do some things with that. The other thing is that most crop insurance agents now have some analysis tool that they can run. And if you want to say, okay, here's some different things I'm thinking about, how would this have paid for me over the last 10 years or 20 years? How often would I have got paid? When would it have paid? Some things like that. And so they can do that analysis for you. You know, in my mind, if you're going to use the insurance, you want to pick something that you're comfortable with, and then you need to play with it every year. You can't jump in and out. Or I say you can't, you shouldn't, in my mind, jump in and out. So say, well, it's really dry this year, so I think we'll buy insurance for next year. Well, we don't know what's going to happen with terms of precip. The people I see that get disillusioned with this are frequently people who try it for 3 or 4 years, and they're like, we've had wet years, I'm not going to buy the insurance anymore. And of course, then the next year you have a drought. So you've already paid in, and now you don't get to collect. So I think you have to think about this in terms of a risk management strategy. If it's something you're going to do, in my mind, it's like buying insurance on a house or on a car. You probably hope you don't collect, right? But you have coverage if something happens, then you can. Again, the other thing with this is historically, over the long term, if you participate year in and year out, you're going to get more indemnity back than the cost of the premium. And so, you know, again, whether you want to choose to do it or not is that's your decision. But again, over a 10-year, 15-year period, if you're in it every year over the long term, you're going to get more indemnity back than the cost of the premium. And again, the reason for that is because it's so heavily subsidized. Again, if you have a ranch or you have ground that's on more than one grid, being able to ensure all 11 intervals can be an advantage, I think, just because, sometimes you might get a couple big moisture events at certain times that can impact whether you got a premium or not. And so if you can divide that up on the grids, that can be an advantage to you in terms of increasing the frequency of payment on an indemnity. The big thing in my mind, and this becomes more and more important to me the longer I go, is knowing yourself. How do you think about insurance? How do you want to use the tool? What are your values? What do you believe about using a tool like this? That's really pretty key in my mind in terms of how you want to use the insurance. So here's my contact information. If you would like to visit with me, I'd be happy to sit down. I could set up a Zoom meeting with you. You could be on your end, you could be on your computer, I could be on mine. We could actually look at some scenarios for your particular operation and talk through, what do you want to do? How do you want to use this insurance if it's something you're considering? Also, there's a NEB guide I put together. It's dated a little bit to the current dates in terms of the November, used to be November 15th was the deadline. Now it's December 1st. And also the address for the tool has changed since I wrote the NEB guide, but the other content is still relevant. So that, I guess, would be my presentation. Austin, do you have any questions?
And that's why Cassie exists. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. That was great. One thing I am wondering, how does something like this, a PRF program, coincide with like other insurance programs, relief programs like livestock forage program and like CRP and programs like that, I guess?
Yeah, so livestock forage disaster program, some of that you still can participate in that. NAP you can still participate in. So, there's still the opportunity to participate in those programs.
So the structure of this program, it's based on rainfall, which is a little bit different from a lot of the other relief programs that are maybe based on the drought monitor now. Do you see that kind of that changing in the future? Maybe they do smaller grids so they can better capture what rainfall is in each area, or maybe they do smaller time intervals so that you don't have that scenario where you have the rain at the end of the month and that impacts the whole time interval, Yeah,
so this insurance just recently went through a review where they were looking at some of those things. They didn't really make any changes. So I don't think from my perspective, unless there's a change of administration or some change in approach to risk management, I don't see the insurance changing very much in the near term. Now, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, I don't know. But it just recently went through a pretty significant review, and they basically kind of left it as it was. And so I don't know, but I don't see, unless some really major things change, I don't see the insurance probably changing in the near term much.
I was curious about like those weather stations. So and I don't remember who said this, I did some research myself, but they determine the rainfall based on like the average of 4 weather stations. Is that right?
Yeah, they're looking at the 4 weather stations closest to the center of the grid, and then they're interpolating the data from that for the grid. And this is where I really encourage people to look at this historically. So there's some places, especially in the sandhills, there's not many weather station grids nearby, or there's not many weather stations close by to the grid. So you can get a long ways away from your grid to the nearest weather station. And I have seen scenarios where for some operations, it didn't work as well. And then for others, it did. So that's why I really encourage people to go look at the tool, plug in what you're considering, and think about how would this have worked long-term for me. It's not perfect. There's some disappointment. And in fact, I know some people this year that were disappointed with how much they've gotten paid because they were extremely dry, but it happened to be some rainfall events near these weather stations or at these weather stations didn't coincide with what happened on their ranch. And so there can be some disappointment and frustration with that. Again, over the long term, whenever I've looked at it, it still pays, but it may not correlate exactly with what's happening on your ranch for a specific year.
Did producers take advantage of this program this year, or do you know like the size or the scope of Nebraska producers that did take advantage of this program and got insured under PRF this
Yeah.
year?
So if in the November issue of the Beef Watch newsletter, which is a newsletter we put out every month, Jay Parsons has actually gone and looked at that. So the insurance for Nebraska has been trending up significantly. And over the last 3 years, major indemnities paid. 2022 is going to be approaching like $2.7 paid for every dollar put in terms of premium in Nebraska on this insurance. So what you should expect in a year like this, right? That's what should happen. So I guess what I was saying is the trend is up and people are using it more. You know, when you had a year like 2019 was extremely wet, you know, then you have 2020 where it starts to get dry. I think we see people using it more. And I think also people who've been in it long term, for the most part, have felt like they've gotten value from it. And so they tell neighbors, they tell relation. And so I think that's part of what's driving this up. The other thing I see is I see insurance agents, especially in the last 5 to 7 years, specializing in this insurance and really being aggressive about going out and recruiting people to buy the insurance. You know, they'll come with a portfolio and say, okay, here's what we can do for you. Here's how the insurance would have paid over the last 5 years, 10 years. Here's the dollar return per dollar invested. Well, that starts to get people's attention. So there's been a number of factors, I think, that are driving the increase in the use of the insurance.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for taking the time to be with us today. I think it is great, super informative, and I think producers have a lot to chew on here as they consider PRF insurance here. Just to echo, that deadline is December 1st, so don't put off meeting with your crop insurance agent for too long. For anyone interested in viewing any past Untitled Profitability webinars or coming back to this one for reference, you can visit the Nebraska Farm Bureau website, www.nefb.org. Again, finally, if anyone has any topics that they'd like to see discussed in the future, you can reach out to me, austinh@nefb.org, and we'll look to cover those. But yeah, thank you again, Aaron. If anyone's interested in talking more with Aaron, he shared his contact info, so I'm sure he'd be happy to answer some of your questions. So